I am Locutus of Borg. Resistance is futile. Your life, as it has been, is over.
Resistance is futile. That line alone can send a chill down the spine of anyone who grew up watching a certain silver-domed android glide across a starship bridge, absorbing entire civilizations without breaking stride. But long before the Borg ever assimilated a single soul, Star Trek, the next generation itself had to survive its own assimilation process. A brutal, chaotic, occasionally miraculous journey from a nearly canceled leftover project into one of the most influential science fiction shows ever made. When it premiered in 1987, nobody was betting on it. A syndicated spin-off of a beloved but decades-old cult classic, built on a shoestring, staffed with actors nobody had heard of, led by a Shakespearean stage veteran who didn't even want the job. And yet, across 7 seasons and 178 episodes, The Next Generation didn't just survive. It thrived, spinning off 4 feature films, multiple television successors, and a legacy that's still expanding today with new shows and new fans discovering Captain Picard and his crew for the first time. But what happened behind the studio doors is a very different story than the polished optimism you saw on screen. They were casting wars nobody expected to win. Scripts pulled from a decade-old filing cabinet. Special effects built from glitter and antacid tablets. And real, painful power struggles that pushed actors out the airlock, sometimes literally out of job, long before the cameras ever rolled again. Stick with us to the very end, because the 15th story on this list is about an actress who refused to stay silent, and in doing so, permanently reshape how women were written on the show. Let's set a course for the past and find out what really happened behind the bridge of the Enterprise D. Picture this. The studio has already decided what its new captain should look like. Tall, square-jawed, commanding, someone who could believably fill William Shatner's boots. Then a balding, 50-something British-stage actor walks into the room, and the man steering the whole creative direction of the show takes one look and decides he's completely wrong for the part. That was Patrick Stewart's introduction to Gene Roddenberry. Roddenberry wanted a swaggering, classically heroic leading man. What he got instead was an actor who had spent decades performing Shakespeare in London. Someone with a controlled, almost surgical intensity that felt nothing like the action hero mold Roddenberry had in his head. The initial reaction was dismissive, and it looked, for a moment, like Stewart's audition would go nowhere. But the studio wasn't ready to let the idea die. In an attempt to make Stewart fit the original vision, someone suggested a compromise. Give him hair. A wig was specifically requested and flown over from London so Stewart could try one final audition looking more like the traditional idea of a leading man. He did the scene. The room watched. Then the executives asked to see the same scene again, without the wig. That second take changed everything. The network executive overseeing casting made the final call himself. Hire the Englishman and lose the hairpiece entirely. Roddenberry still wasn't fully convinced, and when the casting news went public, longtime fans of the original series weren't shy about expressing their outrage either, flooding the studio with complaints that the show was doomed before a single frame had been shot. It wasn't doomed. It became one of the most celebrated casting decisions in television history, and the bald, commanding, deeply human performance Patrick Stewart brought to Jean-Luc Picard is now inseparable from what people think of when they picture a great starship captain. It's almost impossible to imagine the bridge of the Enterprise without Worf standing quietly at tactical, and yet the character was never part of the show's original blueprint. When Roddenberry first sketched out the concept for a new Star Trek series, he wanted total separation from the original show's alien roster. No Vulcans, no Romulans, and notably no Klingon. As the production got closer to actually shooting, that plan changed. Roddenberry realized that putting a Klingon in a Starfleet uniform said something enormous without a single line of dialogue. It told the audience, instantly, how much the galaxy had changed since the days of open war between the Federation and the Klingon Empire. So the character was added to the show late. Very late. Late enough that the physical bridge set had already been built with no station assigned to him, which explains why in the earliest episodes Worf spends most of his screen time standing rather than seated, drifting near the back of the bridge because there was simply no chair built for him. Michael Dorn secured the role with an audition unlike any other actor's approach for the show. He stayed completely in character, barely speaking, radiating the stillness of someone who had genuinely lived through war rather than someone performing the idea of it. Roddenberry was sold immediately, and when actress Denise Crosby chose to leave the series partway through its first season, Worf's role expanded further, eventually giving him the formal security position and the seat that had been missing from the start. What began as a last-minute addition turned into the most prolific acting career in Star Trek's history, with Dorn eventually appearing in well over 200 episodes and 5 feature films across multiple series. Not every idea on The Next Generation was born in a 1980s writer's room. A surprising number of its earliest stories actually came from a shelf project nearly 10 years older than the show itself. Back in the late 1970s, Paramount had been deep into developing a full revival of the original Star Trek, an ambitious series that got as far as constructed sets, a detailed creative Bible, hired actors, and completed scripts before the studio pivoted at the last moment and turned the project into a feature film instead. All of that material, the scripts, the concepts, the character arcs, got boxed up and forgotten rather than thrown away. Nearly a decade later, when The Next Generation needed material fast, producers went digging through those old files. The clearest example came during the show's second season, when a real-world writer's strike froze new script development right as the production desperately needed a season premiere. Producers pulled an old concept originally built around a different character entirely, a story about a crew member becoming mysteriously pregnant through an unexplained alien phenomenon, and reworked it for Counselor Troy instead of its original intended character. That reworked story became the Season 2 opener, a separate shelved concept, originally involving a mythological figure confronting the crew of the original Enterprise, was also dusted off and reshaped into an entirely different kind of episode, reframed as a clever con rather than anything supernatural. Roddenberry wasn't always inventing from nothing. Sometimes he was simply rediscovering ideas he'd already built once before. If the scripts were sometimes recycled, the physical production leaned on recycling just as heavily to keep an ambitious show within budget. The Next Generation became remarkably resourceful at repurposing whatever physical material survived from the original 1960s series and the feature films that followed it. The transporter room is the clearest example of this thriftiness. The circular glass discs that Kirk and Spock once stood on before beaming down to any given planet were removed from their original setting, flipped, and reinstalled into the ceiling of the new transporter set, where they became lighting fixtures rather than floor panels. Those same glass pieces didn't stop there either. They went on to appear in later feature films before eventually finding a final home aboard a different starship years later. Underneath its shiny new future aesthetic, the show was quietly recycling pieces of its own history in nearly every frame. Ask almost any fan to hum the opening notes of the Next Generation's theme, and they'll get it right instantly. It's one of the most recognizable pieces of music in science fiction television. What's less well known is that it isn't really an original composition written specifically for this show. The fanfare that opens the sequence was lifted directly from the original 1960s series theme music. The sweeping march that follows, it was composed years earlier for the very first Star Trek feature film. In other words, what audiences experienced as the sound of this new, groundbreaking series was actually a carefully stitched-together combination of music written for entirely different projects. There had been a brand-new, original opening composed specifically for the show by its regular series composer, fully finished and ready to use. But at the last minute, producers set it aside in favor of leaning on nostalgia instead. Given how far ahead of its time the show felt, you might assume its visual effects relied on cutting-edge technology. They didn't. One of its most iconic visual signatures was created with almost embarrassingly simple household materials. The shimmering, dissolving glow of the transporter effect, the moment a character seems to melt into pure light, involved zero computer animation. Technicians filled a container with water, then mixed in finely ground glitter and metallic particles to catch the light. When they wanted a more energetic, bubbling quality, they simply dropped in fizzing antacid tablets to generate motion. This mixture was lit dramatically against a black background and filmed separately from the actors. To assemble the final shot, actors were filmed standing still on the transporter platform. Then that same empty set was filmed again on its own. The glittering, swirling footage was layered on top in post-production, combined with glowing vertical light streaks to create the effect audiences came to know so well. It wasn't until a later spin-off series, years down the line, that the effect finally went fully digital, meaning a jar of glitter and stomach medicine did the job just fine for the better part of a decade. Ask longtime fans about the show's first season, and you'll often get an apologetic wince. It's widely regarded as the weakest stretch of the entire series, and much of that struggle traces directly back to one of Roddenberry's own creative rules. He insisted that the crew of this future enterprise could not argue with one another. No interpersonal conflict, no tension between shipmates. His belief was that humanity, by the 24th century, would have evolved beyond that kind of friction. It was an idealistic vision, but it made for surprisingly flat storytelling. Drama depends on tension, and when every disagreement had to resolve into calm, polite consensus, episodes often felt like extended committee meetings rather than adventures. The chaos behind the scenes made things worse. A close personal associate of Roddenberry's, who held no official production title but wielded enormous informal influence, would frequently send already approved scripts back for unauthorized rewrites, and the writing staff churned through dozens of different writers across a single season as a result. Much of this turmoil has since been documented in later retrospectives and behind-the-scenes accounts. As Roddenberry's health began to decline, producers gradually took over more creative control and started quietly bending his no-conflict rule. One small, almost symbolic detail captures how they did it. One producer reportedly kept a small bust of Roddenberry on his desk, and whenever a writer pitched a story built around genuine tension between crew members, he'd playfully cover the bust's eyes with a tiny blindfold before giving the story the green light. The show's quality took a noticeable leap forward the moment it was finally allowed to let its characters be human. Q is one of the most beloved recurring characters in the franchise, a godlike, mischievous, endlessly entertaining troublemaker. He also exists purely because the pilot episode ran short. The original plan for the series premiere centered entirely on a single mystery involving a strange alien presence hidden beneath a space station. The problem was that story only filled about an hour of screen time, and the network wanted a full 2-hour premiere. So an entirely separate storyline was added. An immensely powerful being who puts humanity itself on trial for the sins of its past. That character became Q. The result was a premiere that essentially ran 2 different shows side by side. One storyline following the actual mystery, the other periodically interrupted by a smug, all-powerful figure passing judgment on the entire human race. Sharp-eyed fans and critics both noticed the character bore more than a passing resemblance to a similarly powerful trickster figure from the original series decades earlier. Interestingly, the actor who would go on to play Q was cast partly on the advice of that same influential behind-the-scenes associate mentioned earlier, based on his work on an entirely unrelated daytime drama. Whatever the character's origins, audiences fell hard for him almost immediately. He returned again and again throughout the series, evolving from a minor annoyance into something closer to the show's most enduring cosmic wildcard. And fittingly, he's the one who closes out the series' finale years later, putting humanity on trial one final time, echoing exactly where his story began. Most actors wait for an invitation. Whoopi Goldberg decided to skip that step entirely. As a child in the 1960s, Goldberg watched the original Star Trek and saw something she'd rarely seen anywhere else on television. A black woman serving on the bridge of a starship, treated as a full equal without a single line of dialogue explaining why that should be remarkable. That image stayed with her for decades. By the time The Next Generation was in production, Goldberg was already an Oscar-nominated star with major box office credibility. She didn't need a supporting role on a syndicated science fiction show, but she wanted one anyway, and she called the producers directly to ask for it. At first, nobody took the call seriously, assuming it was some kind of prank. It took a phone call from a cast member she already knew personally to convince the production that the request was genuine. When she finally sat down with Roddenberry in person, her pitch wasn't about billing or screen time. She simply wanted to be part of a universe that had shaped who she became. Roddenberry responded by creating an entirely new character for her, a wise, otherworldly bartender who existed outside the normal chain of command, someone crew members sought out not for orders but for guidance. Goldberg reportedly took a significant pay cut to play the role, because for her it wasn't really a job at all. It was a thank you letter written in performance. Decades later, she returned to reprise the same character in a modern Star Trek series, closing a circle that started with a little girl watching television and imagining a future with room for her in it. Patrick Stewart didn't think this show was going to change his life. Honestly, he barely expected it to last a full year. In 1987, he was a respected classical stage actor with a strong theater resume, and starring in an American syndicated science fiction series wasn't exactly part of his career plan. When the offer arrived, a 6-year contract offering far more money than any stage production ever could, he wasn't even sure he wanted to take it. His own representation reportedly framed the opportunity in blunt terms. The show would probably fail quickly, so he should collect the paycheck and be ready to head home to England once it inevitably got canceled. Stewart found that logic persuasive enough to sign on. When he arrived in Los Angeles, he moved into a modest furnished apartment and deliberately left most of his belongings packed in suitcases, anticipating the call telling him it was over and he could go home. Season 1 ended without that call coming. So did Season 2. Ratings kept climbing instead of collapsing. And somewhere around the 3rd season, Stewart quietly stopped expecting the axe to fall. What had been sold to him as a short, well-paid detour turned into 7 seasons for feature films and eventually a modern revival series that let him return to the role decades later, entirely on his own terms. He's since described the experience as the most successful failure of his career, a show he arrived at expecting to leave any day and stayed with long enough to help define an entire era of television.